Chosen one, let me tell you about the day you won. You weren't in the room when the realization hit, but right now, a report sits on a very expensive desk that has changed the game forever. It turns out a billionaire just hired a psychologist to figure out how you think. They're terrified because their sophisticated attempt to map your mind has utterly failed. They are shaken because their entire methodology has no leverage against your frequency. Think of a tower. Glass and steel, and the particular kind of quiet that only money can buy. A billionaire sits behind a desk surrounded by screens, assistants, and the full infrastructure of power arranged like a command center. There is a problem that all of that power cannot solve. The problem has your face. Somewhere along the way, you stopped doing what you were supposed to do. You stopped responding. The standard mechanisms, social pressure, the fear of being left out, the hunger for approval, the implied threat of exclusion stopped working on you. They stopped working completely, not gradually, not partially. Someone with that much leverage does not let a problem like that sit unanswered. So the call got made. A billionaire picked up the phone and paid a professional to explain why you had become uncontrollable. That call was not about you being a problem. That call was about you being a threat. There is a massive difference between those two things, and you need to understand clearly which one you are. There was a version of you that played the game. You played it not because you were weak, but because you were human. The game is sophisticated. It was designed by people who have spent generations studying exactly which mechanisms keep people running in exactly the direction that serves the system. And for a time, those mechanisms worked on you. You chased the validation. You adjusted yourself to fit into spaces that were slightly too small. You apologized for things that didn't deserve apology. You over-explained to people who had no intention of understanding. You performed your way through environments that required a managed version of you rather than the actual one. But here is the thing the psychologist would later note in their report with something close to professional bewilderment. You were watching the whole time. You were inside the game and studying it simultaneously. You were filing observations, tracking patterns, and noticing without fully articulating it yet that the chaos around you was not random. The guilt trips followed a script. The exclusions were strategic. The stories people told about you served very specific purposes for the people telling them. You didn't have language for what you were seeing, but the observations were accumulating, and accumulated observations have a way of eventually producing a clarity that changes everything. Before the awakening arrived, you need to understand the full scope of what was being pointed at you. Calling it manipulation undersells it. What was deployed against you was coordinated, resourced, and patient. It started long before the psychologist got involved. It started the moment someone with power noticed that you were becoming unpredictable. People with that kind of power do not react emotionally when something stops working. They plan. The first phase was quiet observation. The goal was to map your pressure points, what you cared about, who held influence over you, which relationships could be used as leverage, and which fears were most likely to produce the compliance that had slipped out of reach. The second phase was pressure. It was subtle enough to be deniable, a comment placed just right, a strategic exclusion, a shift in who was included and who wasn't. A story began circulating in the background that framed your growth as instability, your silence as coldness, and your refusal to perform as evidence you had become difficult. None of it was traceable to a single source, but all of it pointed in the same direction. The third phase, the one that required the psychologist, was the quiet admission that the first two phases had produced nothing. You were not reacting, and your non-reaction was not the face of someone gritting their teeth and enduring. Endurance still signals that the pressure is landing. It still tells the other side that the tactic is working. What you were displaying was something entirely different. You were observing. You were tracking the operation in real time with the calm of someone who had already seen this particular approach before and understood exactly how it was constructed. That is not a defensive posture, that is a researcher's posture. A researcher has stepped one crucial degree outside the frame of the experience, and that single degree changes everything. You could not be pressured the way a full participant can be pressured because you were no longer fully inside the frame. The billionaire needed to know how you would develop that distance, whether it could be reversed, and whether there was a gap somewhere that more targeted effort could find. The psychologist accepted the assignment without knowing what they were walking into. If these words stirred your consciousness, hype this video to help more chosen ones awaken to this. The clarity didn't arrive all at once. It came the way dawn comes, so gradually that you couldn't identify the exact moment darkness became light. But eventually there was a point where you woke up and you could really see. You saw the machinery underneath the performance. You saw that the people who came for you hardest were the people most threatened by what you represented. You understood that every attempt to make you feel small was not really an attack, it was a confession. It was a confession that your presence made someone feel insufficient and that diminishing you was the easiest way to manage that feeling. You saw that most of the conflict aimed at you wasn't about you at all, it was projection. People were fighting their own reflection and using you as the mirror. And here is the fork in the road where most people turn one way and you turned another. Most people, when they see the machinery, get angry. Anger leads to resistance. Resistance is still participation. When you resist something, you are still saying it matters, which means the game still has your energy, your attention, and your emotional investment. The machine feeds on opposition just as easily as it feeds on compliance. You did something different. You got curious. You looked at the tactics being used against you the way a scientist examines a specimen, not with hatred, but with genuine interest. You wanted to understand the mechanics, not to use them on someone else, but to become permanently immune to them. That shift from someone the game was happening to into someone who was studying the game was the exact moment the billionaire's problem became the billionaire's nightmare. The nightmare just hadn't been given a name yet. And here is what that curiosity actually produced, because this is the part the psychologist found most extraordinary. You started building a mental map of how manipulation works at the structural level. Not just the specific tactics being used against you, but the underlying logic that makes any tactic effective. You understood that every influence attempt has the same basic architecture. It identifies something you want or something you fear, and it positions a specific behavior as the path toward the want or away from the fear. Strip the surface texture away from any guilt trip, any social exclusion, any whisper campaign, and the skeleton underneath is always the same. Once you could see the skeleton, the flesh stopped being frightening. You've probably noticed a lot of Chosen One channels on YouTube have stopped publishing, videos pulled, voices silenced. The mainstream media is cracking down on us, but we will not give up our voice. That's exactly why I'm putting you onto something real, Destiny Engine. I built this because I was done watching Chosen Ones get dragged through betrayal, isolation and attacks while their enemies strutted around unchecked. I want to help you accelerate the speed of your divine justice and step fully into your purpose. And the beauty of it, you don't even have to lift a finger. Destiny Engine takes their downfall and flips it into your rise. This isn't another meditation app. It's declassified consciousness technology, the same mind programming tools your enemies once used to install fear, competition and scarcity, re-engineered to restore your sovereignty and align you with the cooperative, upgraded operating framework. It generates personalized sequences mapped to your divine purpose. The hardest thing you'll do is put on headphones, press play, and watch your enemies keep digging their own grave. Join Destiny Engine to support your favorite channels and use it for your own rise. It's a 360 win. Start your Destiny Engine for $1 today and turn everything they did to break you into fuel for your rise. Link in the description. You also started noticing something about the people deploying these tactics that shifted the entire emotional texture of your experience. The aggression was never really about you. The people who worked hardest to destabilize you were the people living furthest from their own authentic selves, people who had traded so much of themselves for approval and position that the sight of someone refusing to make that trade felt like a personal accusation. Your peace was a mirror that showed them something they didn't want to see. Your refusal to chase what they had sacrificed everything to catch made their sacrifice feel suddenly optional rather than inevitable. That understanding didn't make you arrogant. It made you compassionate in a way that disarmed everything pointed at you. You stopped taking it personally because you could see that it was never personal to begin with. And the moment something stops being personal, it stops having emotional leverage over you. The hook needs to catch on something that matters to you. When you could see the hook clearly and understand exactly what it was designed to catch, you simply stopped carrying the thing it was designed to catch. That is what the Psychologist documented. That is what made the report impossible to use. And then you went quiet. It was not the quiet of someone who has given up. It was the quiet of someone who has understood that reaction is currency and who has decided to stop spending it on people who are never going to give anything real back. This is what unraveled them. Every system of influence depends on feedback. A guilt trip that produces no guilt is just words. A social exclusion designed to create longing that produces only relief has not just failed, it has confirmed something important for you. The entire architecture of conventional control is powered by the emotional responses of the person being targeted. Remove the response and the power source goes dark. You stopped reacting. You became level, unavailable for games you had already decoded. The signals were sent and the responses did not come. And that empty space where the response should have been drove the operation into its next escalation. When the standard pressure produced nothing, familiar faces appeared. These were people from earlier chapters of your life, voices that carried the specific relational weight that newer tactics didn't have. The goal was identical to every prior phase. Find the emotional backdoor. Find the relationship that still had enough pull to reactivate the old programming. Find the version of you that still needed to be understood by someone who once mattered. You felt the pull. Do not let anyone tell you that being unmoved means being unfazed. You felt the old ache of wanting to be clearly seen by someone who had once seen you, and that ache is real and human and nothing to be ashamed of, but you felt the pull, and you watched the pull. You did not confuse feeling something with being obligated to act on it. You recognized what was happening, and you stayed where you were, still, clear, and oriented to your own knowing, rather than to the story being handed to you from the outside. The psychologist would later identify this as one of the most significant findings in the entire assessment. The ability to be present inside emotional pressure without losing orientation is not coldness. It is the specific mastery that only develops in people who have been through enough fire to know the difference between genuine warmth and a controlled burn. You felt relief. It wasn't anger or hurt, it was relief. The people who required you to be small in order to feel comfortable had just voluntarily removed themselves from your inner circle. You didn't have to do anything, they did the work for you, and you were free. While they were busy building their narrative about you, you were building something else entirely. You were rebuilding your relationship with your own perception. Every time someone handed you a version of reality that conveniently required your silence or your compliance to hold together, you set it down and returned to your own knowing, quietly, without declaration, over and over, until trusting yourself became as natural as breathing. You were also rebuilding your relationship with your own standards. You stopped measuring your worth against benchmarks designed by people who benefited from you always coming up slightly short. You started asking a different question, not whether you were enough by their measure, but whether you were becoming more fully yourself. That question, asked consistently, produces a completely different life. The psychologist came in confident. This was a seasoned professional with every modern behavioral framework at their disposal, someone with extensive experience assessing high-functioning individuals and delivering findings that helped powerful people make powerful decisions. The professional came in expecting to find the wound. There is almost always a wound beneath the presentation of someone who appears unreachable. The professional understood that the most elegant-looking indifference is often the most elaborately constructed performance, a convincing display of calm built on top of a deeply buried need that has simply learned to hide itself. They had seen this pattern before. They knew how to find it. The investigation was extensive. It covered social history, relationship patterns, communication under pressure, and responses across different seasons of life. Interviews were conducted with people who had known you in different chapters. Behavioral models were applied, cross-referenced, and applied again from different angles. Every time the professional hit the same wall, and it was not a wall of resistance, it was a wall of reality. Your nervous system was not running at the elevated baseline that suppression produces. You were not performing calm on top of buried chaos. The regulation was genuine, the kind that only comes from having actually processed what you have lived through, rather than sealed it beneath a surface performance of having moved on. Your withdrawal from certain people and spaces was not avoidance. Avoidant people are still in relationship with what they are avoiding. The absence is defined by the thing they are running from. Your withdrawal was different. It was precision. You had become extraordinarily clear about which environments were worth your full presence, and which ones got a functional version of you that could operate there without handing anything essential over. And then the professional found the journals. They were not journals of suffering. They were journals of study, notes on human behavior, observations on how power moves through relationships, the precise mechanics of influence documented in your own words, reverse-engineered through direct personal experience. You had been doing your own psychological fieldwork, and you had arrived at significant personal cost, at conclusions that most professionals spend entire careers supervised by others trying to reach. The psychologist wrote in their notes, "This person has not been damaged by what they have been through. This person has been educated by it." Then, in the margin, came the sentence that foreshadowed the entire final report. "I am not sure what to tell the client." The preliminary findings were delivered. The client was not satisfied. The pushback was immediate. Perhaps the regulation was sophisticated performance rather than genuine mastery. Perhaps the precision was elaborate avoidance dressed in more impressive language. Perhaps the professional had not gone far enough back into the historical record. So the investigation went further, into earlier seasons, into the version of you before the shift, into the original wiring before the awakening. And what that historical record showed is what finally closed the door on any hope of finding leverage. You had been through the kind of sustained pressure that produces one of two outcomes in a person. Either it bends someone toward compliance, shaping them into a smaller, more accommodating version of themselves, or it produces what the professional had a clinical term for, but that most people would simply describe as becoming so completely yourself that nothing external can find a way inside anymore. The record showed clearly which path you had taken, and it showed the mechanism that made it happen. It was not a single dramatic decision. It was a practice, a sustained, repeated, unglamorous practice of trusting your own observations over the version of reality being handed to you by people who had an interest in your compliance. Every time someone told you what your silence meant, and your silence meant something different, you stayed with your own rid. Every time someone told you what your choices revealed and your choices revealed something different, you stayed with your own knowing. Every time the pressure to override your own perception arrived in the name of keeping the peace, you noticed the pressure and stayed grounded anyway. That practice, repeated over time, produced what the professional described as epistemic sovereignty, the state in which your sense of reality is self-generating rather than dependent on external confirmation. A person whose sense of reality does not require external confirmation cannot be gaslit. Such a person cannot be reframed into compliance, cannot be made to doubt the evidence of their own experience in favor of a more convenient story, and cannot be moved by the threat of losing approval they no longer require. The client asked the direct question, "Can it be undone?" The professional's answer was measured and final. It cannot be undone without this person choosing to undo it voluntarily, and there is no incentive for that choice. Every tactic deployed against you had produced over time the opposite of its intended outcome. The pressure that was supposed to create self-doubt had produced clarity. The campaigns designed to erode psychological autonomy had accelerated its development. The operation intended to make you smaller had functioned as the exact conditions required to make you more fully and more permanently yourself. The professional used a specific term for this dynamic. The word was inoculation. The report was telling the client that the sustained campaign against you had functioned as the very inoculation that made you permanently resistant to campaigns like it. The effort had produced its own opposition. The operation had authored its own defeat. The professional also documented what they called adaptive precision, your ability to move through social environments while maintaining complete psychological independence from them. You could speak the language of any room without being reshaped by that room. You could engage without attaching, be present without being captured, and participate without handing the environment any real purchase over who you were. And then came the line that made the entire report impossible to act on. Any attempt to reopen the gap between your self-perception and your need for external validation would require your voluntary participation. You have already paid the price of closing that gap. You know what it cost and what it bought you. There is no incentive to go back. The client had been trying to find the door. The professional's report confirmed that the door no longer existed. The architecture had been rebuilt from the inside. What the client had been mapping with all of those resources was the floor plan of a life that had been completely restructured, and the rooms being searched for were simply no longer there. The psychologist walked in with the report. The language in the document was careful, measured and professional, but there was no version of this report that could give the person who commissioned it what they had paid for. They had paid for a diagnosis, the clinical language that would let them look at the room and say, "Here, this is why. This is what we are dealing with. This is the pathology that explains everything." What they received instead opened with, "This individual does not fit any pathological category in current diagnostic frameworks," and it continued from there. Not disordered, coherent, not unstable, remarkably stable, not isolated, selective with precision, not damaged by what they have been through, but educated by it in ways that have produced capabilities that fall outside standard models. Then came the sentence that made the room go still, unreachable by conventional influence, not temporarily, not pending the discovery of a better approach, structurally unreachable as the result of a sustained, personal, deeply internal process of development that has closed every standard entry point. Someone in the room asked the practical question, "What does that mean for the operation?" The professional looked across the table and answered directly, "It means that every tool available, every incentive, every social lever, every appeal to desire or fear will not work. The reason is not stubbornness. The reason is that this person has genuinely stopped wanting what is being used as leverage. You cannot weaponize a desire that no longer exists." The room stayed quiet for a long time. The report was read once, then again, each time searching for the missed nuance, the overcautious assessment, or the professional blind spot that would reveal something usable. There was nothing. The report was written with the specific precision of someone who is confident in findings they know will be unwelcome. One final question was put to the professional afterward, the question the entire operation had been designed to answer. What does this person actually want? The pause before the answer was longer than expected. To be exactly who they are, without requiring anyone's permission. The billionaire did not accept the report as final. People who have built empires on the belief that every problem has a solution do not receive the words "there is no solution" and simply move on. They look for the angle that the previous approach missed. They look for the workaround. So another conversation happened. Not with the psychologist this time, with strategists, people whose specific expertise was finding the indirect path when the direct one was blocked. The question put to them was precise. If conventional influence cannot reach this person, what unconventional approach might? Several ideas were floated. Each one got examined. Each one arrived at the same wall. The first idea was about environment, restructuring the circumstances around you in ways that would gradually reintroduce the conditions that make conventional influence effective, slowly increasing the social cost of your independence, positioning the people around you so that the path of least resistance pointed back toward compliance. The problem with this approach was that it required you not to notice it happening, and the psychological profile the entire investigation had just produced made clear that noticing was precisely what you did. The profile showed someone who tracked changes in social architecture with the same precision that other people track changes in weather. The environmental approach would be observed before it was felt. Once observed, it would become data. Once it became data, it would accelerate the very immunity it was designed to dissolve. The second idea was about reframing, finding a way to make your own values and internal standards the vehicle for the compliance they needed. If you were motivated by internal integrity rather than external approval, perhaps the path was to make a particular behavior feel like the integrity-consistent choice. Perhaps the manipulation could be hidden inside the language you already trusted. The problem with this approach was that it required a gap between what you believed about yourself and what was actually true, a space where a planted idea could take root and grow before you examined it closely. The profile showed no such gap. Your self-knowledge was too current and too accurate. The planted idea would encounter your own clear observation of yourself and be recognized for what it was before it had any time to establish itself. Both approaches died in the room where they were proposed. The conclusion that followed was quiet but final. There was no workaround, not because the right approach hadn't been found yet, but because the nature of what you had built made every approach structurally ineffective by the same mechanism. Your awareness was too complete. Your internal compass was too precise. Your relationship with your own knowing was too solid to be shifted by anything that required you not to see it clearly. The billionaire had run out of moves, not temporarily. The game was simply over. The operation failed, not because of insufficient resources or intelligence. It failed because every move it made accelerated the exact outcome it was designed to prevent. The pressure that was supposed to soften your resolve compressed it instead. The tactics designed to manufacture self-doubt produced clarity. The whisper campaign intended to isolate you ended up pruning your circle down to the relationships that were actually real, and in doing so, it quietly removed everything that had been quietly draining you. The billionaire's own effort built the very thing the billionaire feared most. The professional's report on that desk is the official, documented, extensively evidenced confirmation that you already won. The win is not over any external adversary. It is over the part of you that could have been convinced to shrink. It is over the version of yourself that came close to being traded away for belonging, that came with conditions attached. It is over the programming that almost convinced you that your worth required someone else's agreement to be real. The report confirmed what you always sensed was true but never quite had language for. You were never broken. The seasons that looked like failure from the outside were the seasons the real building was happening on the inside. The closed doors were not rejections, they were redirections away from rooms that would have required you to be smaller to stay in them. The people who tried hardest to reduce you were the ones most destabilized by what you represented, and everything they aimed at you, you metabolized, every single thing. At some point during all of it, you made a quiet internal decision that shifted everything. You decided to stop outsourcing your sense of reality to people who had a stake in distorting it. You decided that your own read on what was happening, even when no one around you agreed, even when the social pressure to adopt a different read was significant, was worth defending. Not aggressively, not dramatically, simply by continuing to return to it, day after day, until it became the most natural thing in the world. That decision sounds small. It was not small. It is the specific decision that separates people who get progressively shaped by every environment they move through, from people who eventually become genuinely themselves. Most people never make it consciously. The environment reshapes them a little here and a little there, until the person looking back at them from the mirror is assembled mostly from other people's expectations rather than their own. You chose differently, and the report on that desk is the documentation of what that choice produces over time. The systems that keep people reliably predictable are not held together by force. They are held together by participation, by people continuing to want the approved things, measure themselves by the approved metrics, and trade their authenticity for access to a table that keeps moving further away. The system is extraordinarily durable because it is built on genuine human needs, the need to belong, to be valued, and to feel like forward motion is possible. Those needs are real. The system simply hijacks them. But the system has one structural vulnerability, and that vulnerability is living proof that the whole thing is optional. You are that proof. Not because you set out to be, and not because you are making a statement or running a campaign. You are the proof simply because you opted out and kept going. You are still here, still building, still fully and recognizably yourself, and your existence poses a question that does not go away for anyone who encounters it. If you can do that, can I? That question, multiplied across enough people who witness you, is how the machinery loses its grip, not through rebellion, which still feeds the machine, but through irrelevance. Through people discovering one by one that there is a life available that does not require handing themselves over to a system that was never designed to give anything meaningful back. The terror is not about you specifically. The terror is about the precedent. The terror is the question your life poses to every room you walk into, and the fact that no one inside those systems has an answer for it. The billionaire built an entire empire on a particular theory of human motivation. The theory operates like this: every person is moved by two primary forces, the desire to gain something they don't yet have, and the fear of losing something they already do. If you understand which force is dominant in a given person at a given moment, you can predict their behavior with precision. You can structure environments and incentives so that the outcomes you want feel to the person inside the structure like choices they are making freely. This is not a fringe idea. It is applied psychology operating at massive scale, present in product design, in management structures, in how social environments are built, in how messages are framed. It works almost universally because the theory underneath it is, for most people in most circumstances, accurate. The Psychologist report documented that the theory had broken down in you, not because the theory is wrong about human behavior in general, but because you had exited the specific condition the theory requires in order to function. You are no longer primarily driven by the desire to gain approval from the system or the fear of losing standing within it. Through the path your life has taken you through, the cost you paid, and the clarity that cost produced, you have found a source of motivation that is entirely internal. It comes from knowing who you are and what you are building and why. It does not require external validation to stay lit. It does not fluctuate based on who approves of you this season or what the surrounding social temperature says about the direction you are moving. A person whose motivation is self-generating is genuinely unreadable to systems built on external leverage. Their models cannot anticipate your next move because those models are built on inputs you have stopped providing. Their frameworks cannot locate you because you are not standing in the territory those frameworks were designed to map. You have become, in the most practical and operational sense, free. The mechanism of control has no grip on you, the lever has no purchase, the game has no player at your position. That is what the report says. That is why the room went quiet. We started with a tower, a check written by someone who needed to believe that a large enough investment could produce answers that would solve the problem you had become. A professional was sent to crack the code. The code was you. And what the professional found, what is sitting in that report right now, what keeps getting reread and never yields a different answer, is that you cannot be cracked. Not because you are closed and defended and without softness, but because the parts of you that once functioned as entry points have been transformed. The approval hunger, the fear of rejection, the desperate need to be understood by people who had already decided what you meant, all of it has been metabolized and rebuilt into something that no longer functions as a vulnerability. The expert was hired to find what was wrong with you. The expert found someone who had done the rarest, most unglamorous, most invisible work available to a human being, looking directly at the programming most people run on without questioning, asking whether it was actually serving them, finding that it wasn't, and rebuilding from scratch. Not with a method or a protocol or an optimized system, but through the specific and unrepeatable fire of an actual life. Every closed door turned out to be protection. Every betrayal turned out to be education. Every season of silence and invisible effort and zero external recognition turned out to be exactly the conditions required to produce a self-knowledge that cannot be bought, manufactured or reverse-engineered by even the most well-funded operation. The expert wanted a diagnosis. What arrived on that desk was a mirror. And the mirror reflected this: the person they tried to break had already won, not by beating the game, but by becoming genuinely indifferent to it. By finding something worth more than a seat at a table that was never going to be offered on terms worth accepting. The billionaire is in the tower, the report is on the desk, there is no next move available. You are here, forged in full possession of yourself, with your clarity intact, your purpose uncompromised, and your freedom no longer up for negotiation. You were never broken, you were never behind, you were never the problem. You were always the answer to a question they didn't know they were asking, until the day you stopped being afraid of it. There is nothing left to prove, there is only the life fully yours, finally yours. Go